Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Trauma Informed Church Kid Podcast. Today and every day, we are reconstructing religion for the hurting with theology that doesn't hurt. This may wind up being the last normal episode we have for a while. I'll be honest and straightforward with you all. Doing this podcast has been quite a significant strain on my resources. I don't really mean financially. I've tried to keep this as low budget as possible, but psychologically and emotionally. I find myself wondering and worrying about the reach of this podcast, about if I'm being sensitive enough to the varied histories of all the people, if I'm coming off too preachy or not, and if that's triggering people, if I have put up enough citations and research or not, etc. I also wonder and worry a lot about the effect all this wondering and worrying has on me. There is a, curious, shall we say, confluence of when this podcast started and when my speech difficulties kicked into high gear. Coincidence? Spiritual warfare? A sign from God? I'm not sure, honestly. Here's all I do know. I will need a break, sooner rather than later. So, since this episode is on Genesis 11, and that marks a turning point of sorts in the genre of the narrative, I think that feels like a good stopping point. Don't worry or wonder yourselves. I will continue to put out content likely through the remainder of the school year. Then, like the educator I used to be, take a break over the summer and begin again next school year with Season 2. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Today, we are in Genesis 11 in the famous, or infamous, Tower of Babel event. This is the view that is traditionally presented about this event. The whole world spoke one language. The people got together to build a tower to reach the heavens. God felt either threatened or angry about this, and smote them with confusion of speech so that they couldn't understand one another. Then they all spread out, and here we are. For most people, this is just another one of those discrete biblical stories, separated out from the rest of the narrative. It stands alone as a sort of Rudyard Kipling just so story. A myth, true or not, about how we got different languages. Then we move on to Abraham and the good stuff. But really, that just isn't the best way to look at this story. Not only because it makes Adonai seem rather petty with a fragile ego trying to keep humanity from getting too big for their britches. This traditional reading misses the nuance of context and reception history that this text has undergirding it. And that is the story we will dive into today. I submit to you that the Tower of Babel is the culmination of the third fall of humanity, humanity's descent into demonic idolatry. Being the lover of patterns that I am, the alliteration is quite intentional and hopefully helpful for remembering the consequences of each of those three falls: death, depravity, and demons. All of which must be reversed if humanity is to be rescued. Why do I say this is a descent into demonic idolatry when there isn't an explicit mention of it in the text? Well, because of the research we have uncovered into the A&E cultural background of this text. Our texts we write do this all the time. We assume common cultural knowledge, and if we refer to it at all, we usually don't, at least explicitly. We do so in oblique or nod and wink fashion. I think that the biblical text of Genesis 11 does the same thing. In large part, I think this because of the ways in which the incident is spoken of in other portions of the text. Take Deuteronomy 32, for example. Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you. Your elders, and they will tell you. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance. When he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. This is in the English Standard Version, but other versions will say things like, according to the number of the heavenly assembly, NET Bible, or his heavenly court, NLT, according to the number of the gods, NRSV, or according to the number of the angels of God, Septuagint. The majority of translations will say, according to the number of the sons of Israel, see KJV, NASB, NIV, etc. What gives here? This is due to the text that the particular translation is working off of, without getting too nerdy. Suffice it to say that I am team Sons of God, because Sons of Israel doesn't seem to make much sense at all here to me. Because, as we discovered last episode, that number is 70, or possibly 72. Deuteronomy 32 is describing the end result of the Babel event, the dispersal of the nations and their being assigned to spiritual beings, whose job it was to be their shepherd or guide or guardian, to be the mediator for them between heaven and earth. This is one piece of a larger interpretive framework called the Divine Council Worldview, or DCW for short. It was popularized by the late Dr. Michael Heiser, and you can find more detail on it in his book Supernatural, which is more lay-oriented, or Unseen Realm, which is more scholar-oriented. The core idea here is that the conceptual world of the A&E, and therefore the Bible, believe that other gods did actually exist. There is a species of divine or spiritual beings called Elohim, who are the sons of God in the heavenly realm. We met them, or at least some unsavory ones among them, in Genesis 6, with the Prodigal Sons of God episode, The Watchers. I will have to do a separate episode on spiritual beings, so unfortunately I'll have to table whatever questions you may have for now. In the meantime, just check out the links I put in the show notes. In any case, I am convinced that the Babel event of Genesis 11 is the origin story of the gods of the nations, who sit in the divine council of Adonai. This is both a human fall and an angelic fall, since as Psalm 82 tells us, these spiritual beings failed the divine commission and are judged for it. Rather than lead the nations back to Adonai, they led them astray into accepting worship for themselves. In a word, into idolatry. But there I go, getting ahead of myself again. Sorry. Let's get back to Genesis 11. Or, more precisely, let's step back to Genesis 10. There, Nimrod, one of Ham's descendants, builds a series of cities in the land of Shinar, one of which is Babel. This connects us to the opening lines of the Babel story. As people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. 11:2. So it's important to download the story of Ham when we consider a place founded by one of his line. Furthermore, Nimrod is the son of Cush, who is associated not with Mesopotamia, where Shinar is located, but with Nubia in Egypt. Shinar is actually more appropriately in Sethite territory. So an ancient reader would be picking up both geographical and genealogical clues that Babel itself is suspect from the beginning. The final clue comes from Genesis 10 and its description of Nimrod, a mighty man. The Hebrew word here is Gibor, and while it is not always a negative association throughout the Hebrew Bible, it certainly is in Genesis. The only other place we find it is in the descendants of the Watchers, born out of illicit and demonic sexual rituals, the Nephilim. This is precisely why the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament about 2 centuries before Jesus, translates this word as giant, just like the giants before the flood. Babel is not just some ordinary city innocently trying to make a name for itself. In the context of Genesis 11, Babel is the beginning of a retread of all that led up to the need for the flood. So that should give us some context about the bricks and mortar which are used to build Babel as well. The language parallels what we find in the narrative of the children of Israel in Egypt, also one of Ham's descendants, where Pharaoh forces them to make bricks as part of their slavery to his empire. The mortar here is a reference to tar that bubbles up out of subterranean regions and is connected to Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 14. Given the provenance of the founder of Babel and the linguistic parallels to slavery in Egypt using hellish slime for mortar, a careful read of the narrative points us in the direction of a proto-empire built on the backs of slaves for the grandiose ego of one man. Furthermore, this is not a tower like the Tower of Pisa is a tower. This is almost certainly a ziggurat, a sacred site built for sacrificial rituals and the economy surrounding those practices. So again, we have multiple connections to the demonic in the story of Babel, a semi-Nephilim who founds a city built on slaves, designed for sacrificial worship that likely involves some pretty horrific rituals. That is the context we should have in mind when the people say, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves." 11:4. Remember Genesis 6 in the Nephilim? They were described as men of renown. That is the same Hebrew word for name in Genesis 11. Again, we see the connection to demonic practices. The desire of the inhabitants of Babel are to propagate the idolatrous rituals that are associated most closely with the Nephilim that caused the need for the flood. And that is why we see Adonai himself come down in Genesis 11, because the depravity problem is starting up again. Remember back in Genesis 6, after the Nephilim incident, when Adonai said that his spirit could no longer contend with or abide in man because his thoughts were evil? That is an example of what we might call the holiness dilemma. Adonai is infinitely holy, which means more than just super good. It means that our very ontology of being, the mere fact that we are creatures, creates infinite separation and distance between him and us. Yet, he desires to dwell within his creation and has designated humans as that hinge point between heaven and earth. We are the conduit, the divine water hose, so to speak, that carries the love and grace of Adonai to all of his creation. But what to do when that water hose closes off the spigot because of its sinfulness? The living water is still flowing, but it is blocked up because the mediators between heaven and earth, humanity, are so stuffed with gunk that the flow has dwindled to a trickle. That is the holiness dilemma. What can be done when an infinitely holy God desires to dwell in impure space, given that he has chosen impure people as the vessels of his mercy? The Genesis 6 solution is for Adonai to step back a bit. This is not because he has some kind of sin allergy and reacts with wrath whenever he encounters it. This is because he knows that when the water hose is so clogged up, for him to unleash more force of his living water would burst the pipe. It would destroy us, as it did in the flood. That is why the Spirit needs to withdraw and no longer contend or abide with humanity. And that is why Adonai needs to come down when it all starts up again. If we, like the ancient audience, understand the holiness dilemma, that statement should make us very deeply unsettled. Adonai coming down to earth is something that, because of our finitude and unfaithfulness, is deeply, deeply dangerous to us. Again, not because he will smite us out of anger, but because for us to encounter the divine presence in our current state would likely burn us up. This is why when biblical figures encounter divine manifestations, they invariably tear their clothes, fall to the ground, weep and wail, "Woe is me, I am undone." That is why the first thing that most of these angelic and/or divine manifestations say is, "Do not be afraid." The finite, being in the presence of the infinite, breaks our brains and our being in ways that are not about punishment. Thus, when Adonai comes down, this is very much a "be careful what you ask for" moment. And they did ask for it. The text says that they desired to build a city with a tower with its top in the heavens. Now, on a purely literal level, this is absurd. To begin with, the heavens are not a literal spatio-temporal location that can be reached through means such as this. This was seen as true even in the ANE context, so no chronological snobbery here citing primitive peoples as an excuse for idiocy. What then does a tower with its top in the heavens mean? It means that this was designed to be a meeting place of heaven and earth, a place where sacrifices could occur and spiritual beings could be called down to inhabit Salem. Once a god was enshrined in a location and an idol, there was a sense in the pagan culture that the god was connected to and in some ways dependent on the people and the land. This is why the Salem of the god was dressed, fed, and tended to by the priestly caste, because the gods of the A&E world needed humans just as much as the humans needed divine intervention for crops or fertility or success in battle. That is why the people think that they will make a name for ourselves in building Babel. They think that they will get a spiritual being on their side to fight for them and give them wealth and prosperity. That is why Adonai confers within himself and says, "This is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will be impossible for them." 11:6. If successful, they will have the power of spiritual beings on their side, working with them to enact their depraved desires. We've played this song before. We know how it ends. And Adonai has promised to never respond the same way again. So this time, he intervenes sooner and softer. Rather than descending to destroy, he descends to disperse. He confuses their language and disperses them all over the face of the earth. 11:8. Again, this is the earth as the land, and the geography of the genealogy we just read in Genesis 10 demonstrates that this is the known world, not the literal globe. And, as we noted from the context of Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82, this event is not just a scattering of humans. It is an assignation of spiritual beings as their shepherds. All of this is why I say that the dispersal of Babel was a mercy. Not only did Adonai step in sooner and softer to avoid a flood-like descent into depravity, but he also didn't just send his children out into the wilderness to fend for themselves and figure things out on their own. He sent them with what we might call guardian angels today, spiritual beings whose job it is to teach them the ways of Adonai and to bring them back to him. Well, that's a cheery thought. Things are going to be all right then, won't they? No. We find out pretty early on that this arrangement also goes south. Here's Psalm 95:5. "For the gods of the nations are demons, but Adonai made the heavens." This is from the Septuagint Greek translation, but you'll probably notice that several of your English translations say something like, "The gods of the nations are worthless idols." Why the discrepancy? This is mostly a matter of which text, again, but I don't think that it really causes a contradiction in the end. To say that the gods of the nations are demons, or in some translations, devils, is the same as saying that they are worthless idols, because that is what idolatry is, worship of demons. Psalm 106:35 through 37 describes it this way. "Israel served their idols of the nations, which became a snare to them. They sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons. They poured out innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with blood." Notice the overlap between idols, idolatry, and sacrifice to demons. Unless we think that this was a unique instance because of the heinous acts of child sacrifice to Moloch, Paul picks up the same thread in 1 Corinthians. What do I imply then? That food sacrificed to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be partners with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. 10:19 through 21. This is about sacrificial meat being eaten at table in people's homes, not about human sacrifice, and would have been meat from a totally ordinary pagan sacrificial ritual. I'm spending some time on this because there are some who are uncomfortable with the talk of demons and the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms, Ephesians 6:12. This conjures up images of cackling gargoyles in red spandex with pitchforks and horns gleefully cavorting in subterranean caverns surrounded by fire and screams of torment. However, this image comes from medieval Christianity and subsequent popular modern renditions of it. See Chick Tracts, Frank Peretti novels, etc. It does not come from the Bible. The Bible depicts demons as unclean spirits, to use a term that crosses both testaments. They are spirits because their natural state is immaterial, not quite disembodied per se, but not embodied with corporeality. They are unclean because they have aligned themselves with chaos and death rather than order and life. I'll dive deeper into the nature and ranks of various spiritual beings in my next episode. But for now, I want to flag that there is some flexibility and opacity in the language used of demons, devils, and fallen beings in the noetic realm. These are, in some quasi-literal sense, slippery and shadowy creatures. They are not something it is either productive or wise to spend too much time studying, but it is nevertheless quite relevant to a trauma-informed lens on Scripture. Because there has been enormous hurt and harm done in regards to demons and spiritual warfare. This is an unavoidable historical reality in the cases of mental illness or simply being female attributed to demonic possession or influence. It has been used as leverage in modern churches to describe someone who is challenging authority as having either a spirit of unforgiveness or a spirit of dissension or division, or the flexible and almost invariably misogynistic moniker, a Jezebel spirit. Certain branches of Christendom, particularly those of a charismatic bent, seem to find demons under every rock and behind every bush. There are entire systems built up around naming these demons, calling them out, breaking their so-called legal rights over people, and the like. I won't spend too much time on this here because I think that largely these are grotesque caricatures of the actual biblical evidence and often created whole cloth untethered from the biblical evidence. But I know that it causes immense harm to many people. So, as always here, I want to acknowledge our past sins, admit wrongdoing, and repent. And also, as we also always do here, I seek to reconstruct the Scriptures in such a way that recovers their original meaning and beauty, to find a resurrected hope on the other side of deconstruction. So, with that in mind, let's return to the text of Genesis 11. We saw that Adonai dispersed the nations by confusing their language. As I said before, this is best seen as a mercy. Not only because it did not result in total destruction like the flood, but also because it decentralizes the sin and wickedness. St. Jerome, in the 5th century, writes this: "The more sinners there are at one time, the worse they are. Indeed, when the tower was being built up against God, those who were building it were disbanded for their own welfare. The conspiracy was evil. The dispersion was of true benefit, even to those who were dispersed." The scattering of the nations was not something to punitively teach humans their place in the cosmos. It was a means to protect them from their worst selves, to insulate them against groupthink to such a degree that they would fall again into the depravity of the flood generation. And again, as we noted before, Adonai does not just send them off without a guide. He assigns to them Elohim, whose job it is to shepherd the individual nations along the paths of righteousness, to bring them back to Adonai. This is a critical theme in the dispersal of the nations at Babel. The entire point of it was for the purpose of shepherding and regathering. The gods of the nations, the heavenly sons of God, were commissioned as guardians to develop the peoples of the earth into Adonai-shaped people. And this shaping was designed as a beautiful expression of diversity and rich complexity. That is part of the reason why a scattering was desired instead of teaching them all righteousness there at Babel. Adonai doesn't want a family that is all one expression of individuality, where unique cultural expressions are blended into an undifferentiated sameness. He wants a family filled with fantastic diversity and multifaceted beauty. We see that in the prophetic promise of Isaiah after the Babylonian exile of his chosen people, Israel. The prophet describes the raising up of a servant who will lead the people out of exile and back to Zion to remake Israel into the light of the nations once more. Then he says, "The Gentiles, or the nations, shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. Lift up your eyes all around and see. They all gather together. They come to you. Your son shall come from afar, and your daughter shall be nursed at your side. Then you shall see and become radiant, and your heart shall swell with joy, because the abundance of the sea shall be turned to you. The wealth of the nation shall come to you." 60 verses 3 through 5. He goes on to describe the wide variety of differentiated wealth which the nations will bring to Zion, each reflecting the unique glory and special value of every distinct nation and corner of the world. This same picture continues all the way to the end of the Scriptures, where the Apocalypse of St. John describes a great multitude which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palm branches in their hands. Revelation 7:9. This is a vital point for us to remember in the church. We who are resurrected Israel, the body of Christ, often aim for uniformity at the expense of diversity. There are plenty in America today who claim to bear the name of Adonai, who despise and denounce initiatives focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI for short. I understand their concern that often these can feel to them like a poison pill, where a good thing, diversity, comes with baggage that cannot be borne. Example, certain social and political philosophies. But what concerns me the most is the knee-jerk reaction and the automatic wholesale rejection that comes along with this. Rather than exercise discernment, something Jesus tells us to do, Christians in America are inclined to go all or nothing, refusing to celebrate the good meat while spitting out the bones. This is, to me, a failure and a forfeit of our calling to be the light of the nations. We are not called to colonize the nations, to remake them into our image and force them into our ideal. We are called to hold the center, maintain the essence, be uncompromising with the truth, and from that anchor point to joyously celebrate the wide and colorful diversity of the kingdom of God. My daughter has been really getting into rock climbing lately. The thing about an anchor point is that once it's secure, a multitude of options opens up for the line which one can use to continue the climb. Often, to get to a certain grip will require a leap of faith and taking frightening steps outside of our comfort zone. But as long as we trust in the anchor, are secure in our faith, we need not fear diversity, equity, or inclusion. Because that vision is nothing less than the vision of the scriptural family of God. Every tongue, tribe, and nation, all uniquely and distinctly worshiping Adonai. That is why the undoing of the Babel fall is seen as the Pentecost narrative of Acts 2. There, the Spirit does not give the church a single tongue and expect the various nations to conform to that tongue. The Spirit gives the church all the tongues of the nations in order to bring them back home. That is the coda to the third and final fall of humanity. the overthrow of the rebellious gods of the nations who failed to guide all the families of the world, and the removal of the barriers of language in order that they might be one again. And not just one, but the many within the one. So, explain it to me like I'm 5. Okay, ready? The earthly sons of God used the methods of empire to build a tower for unholy sacrifice. God doesn't want to see a repeat of the flood, so he mercifully spreads out the sin all over the earth. And he assigns the heavenly sons of God to shepherd them home to their Father. I hope that this look at the third and final fall of humanity has been helpful for you to better understand who the gods of the nations are, what their original purpose was, why the nations were scattered, and how they are all supposed to eventually come back together in diverse unity. Like always in the narrative of the Scriptures, here we see human failure as well as angelic failure, and Adonai doing what he always does, working with his creation, where they are at, as is, to bring good out of evil. And that is part of my challenge for you today. How can you redeem the things of this world, to celebrate and consecrate the diversity which God has created and ordained? Rather than knee-jerk reacting out of distress or fear or past negative experiences, how can you take a breath and consider how to apply discernment? Ask yourself, is there anything of God in here? And how can I elevate and amplify that? Don't just consider this for political ideas such as DEI or CRT, but also for all things, your friendships, your work, your spouse, your children, that job prospect, etc. In Ephesians 5:16, Paul tells us to redeem the time because the days are evil. You'll notice that the reason for the redemption is the fact that a thing is evil, precisely because evil is nothing more than a parasite. Pluck off that parasite, toss it in the fire, and the inherent goodness of the thing remains. We are often so inclined to immediately judge into binaries, oppressor and victim, toxic and healthy, necessary or irrelevant, Republican or Democrat, black or white, powerful and powerless, etc., etc. This judgmentalism is not a valuable instinct for those who want to seek after the God of the Bible, who created all things with glorious diversity. Rather than run from things simply because it came from X or Y or Z that is of the devil or of the world, we ought to walk cautiously yet curiously to redeem the things of this world from the parasite of evil, to fill up the glory of the nations in the kingdom. Because all authority has been given to Christ, we need not fear the gods of the nations or their works. And that's where I'll leave you today. On YouTube and X, you can find me at Church Kid Pod, and on Facebook, you can join the discussion in our discussion group, Trauma Informed Church Kids. This podcast is hosted through Podbean, so you can find the HQ for all podcast content on churchkidpod.podbean.com. There you will find links to all the major podcast apps you can find me at, as well as notices and other important information. I know that every podcast asks you to do this, but it's especially important as we get started and get the word out there. Please take a minute to subscribe to this podcast on your preferred platform so that you never miss an episode. But also, and more importantly, if you love the content or find it valuable, please give it a 5-star rating. That is really the only way that the algorithms will give me any respect. And without those sweet, sweet 5-star ratings, no one will be able to find this content. If you think I haven't earned a 5-star rating, feel free to message me on social media at ChurchKidPod, and I will see what I can do. I'm always happy to get good, constructive feedback and to improve wherever I can. No matter what your story is, no matter where you come from or where you are, I want to pray for you from the words of St. Paul to the Ephesians, chapter 3, verse 19. I ask God that you may know the love of Christ, which is more than we can ever know. I ask that you may be filled with everything that God has. See you next time.